Top secret project. Something had come down from the mountainside and it was roaring. Holy crap. And so there's this line of tracks that were right next to the creek. My name is Daniel Perez, age 60, born and raised here in Southern California. I got interested in the subject matter at about age 10 by the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek. And I saw that at a walk-in theater. And it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks because at the time, I did not know in this pseudo documentary whether they were presenting or trying to present something that was factual or fictional. But it absolutely had an impact on me. And so from there, I kind of wandered to the library and tried to find out more. And I was kind of connecting the dots between the Fouke monster from Fouke, Arkansas to Bigfoot. And somehow I did. And so I started checking out books at the library on Bigfoot. And I realized that, wow, this is really interesting. And so that was about 50 years ago.
You've had some time to invest in that then. So have you had an actual Bigfoot encounter yourself?
No, I've never seen a Bigfoot in my life, but on multiple occasions I have seen tracks. I wish they were better tracks. And that was the first time, 1980 or 1979 in Hemet, California. I keep getting the dates mixed up, so I say both. Uh, and this was Hemet, California is halfway in between San Diego and Los Angeles. And what was happening, there was a couple there that are now deceased, Dick and June Putnam, who had claimed multiple activity in terms of sightings and footprints. I don't think they actually had a sighting, but their sons did. And so a fellow by the name of an investigator, very well known at the time, probably still is, Peter Gatella, got wind of it. And one of my colleagues at the time, Doug Trapp, uh, got a hold of this information. And so we started going down there. And on this one instance, got to remember this is 1980, 1979. There's no cell phones or anything like that. And I don't even remember if they had a home phone in their house. They weren't well off. And so we made a decision to go down there on the weekend and we knocked at their door and no one was there. And prior to this, it had just rained quite a bit. And so the trip out there must have been maybe 80 miles or so. And so I told Doug, I said, well, now what? And we just kind of looked at one another. And I said, well, why don't we just kind of drive around and look around, see what we can find? And so we headed off onto a dirt road, which was highly rutted. I mean, major ruts from the rain that had just happened. And so I told Doug, I said, we probably should just stop right here, get out before the car gets stuck and we have no way to get out, and just go walking around and look around. And so that's what we did. And we found a small creek that was created by the rain flow. The creek was only there because of the rain. And then we're just looking around. We had no idea where we were going to look. It wasn't planned. It was just kind of scouting around. And so we kind of looked down and kind of almost at the same time, like, holy crap. And so there's this line of tracks that were right next to the creek, crossed the creek, and then kind of went off. But they weren't, I guess the rain had affected them. So we could see the size of the print. I think it was 17 inches long. And the heel there was, I think, about 5 inches. And so we attempted to make, or Doug attempted to make, some plaster of Paris castings. And he had plaster in the trunk of his car, but the plaster was already moist. And so it didn't set up. And so basically when we tried to lift the casting, it just kind of all crumbled. So that was a complete disaster. But then again, we weren't planning for making castings. We weren't planning on seeing footprints, but that was the first time that I had seen tracks. And so looking back, trying to make sense of it, is that is that oh, okay, here's a couple who's had like screams and stuff, and multiple footprint finds, and their sons had a sighting, etc. And so this was just one more thing that was happening that we were able to kind of verify independently of them. And so it really kind of hit home with me, like, oh wow, there really is something going on to this thing that we call Bigfoot. And so I was probably 16, 17 at the time. And so that's kind of what really got me excited. And back then, there was no internet. And so Peter Gatella had a newspaper clipping service on UFOs and Bigfoot. And so we were getting that. Doug was getting that. And so that's how we found out about some of this information that was happening in the Hemet area. I don't think that would be possible today because a lot of that area has grown up, a lot more population, and it went from a sleepy little town that nobody knew about to kind of a small city. The second time I seen tracks was, I believe, August of 1986 in the Monachi Meadows, a different part of California, in the Sequoia National Park or near there. And so CNN had called me or sent either called me or sent a newspaper, not a tear sheet from the wire services. And I think they called me because I think the way I recall it, this is 1986. They said, "Oh, are you going to go out and investigate?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they had proceeded to tell me that there was a sighting on the Kern River by 5 construction workers who were building a footbridge over that river in an area called the Monachi Meadows, kind of heading up towards the Sierras, but kind of the south end of it in California towards the eastern side. And so I asked them to kind of give me some more information. So after I got some more information, I said, well, I'll see if I could go up there and check it out. And so what happened, there was a little break in work. And so I made a decision to drive up there to kind of get in the area because I didn't have anyone's phone number. I didn't have any of that. I didn't really know where anyone was. I just said, I'll just kind of try to get in the area. And so what happened is a guy had come out from the woods. I guess they were working for the United States Forest Service on a contract to build this bridge. And he had, like, I think he had a white truck and he was filling up some gas tanks. And so he was the only guy that was out there. So I asked him and I said, "Hey buddy," I said, "do you know anything about this?" And he goes, "Oh, as a matter of fact, what you're talking about, we're the party involved." And so I said, "Well, how far back are you?" And he said, "Well, it's a little ways back. That's why I brought the truck out." And I said, "We're not allowed to have a truck unless, we have this contract because it's only for pedestrian traffic, not vehicular traffic." And so I jumped in this truck and I threw my backpack in there and we went back out to the area. And this was the first time I met these 5 guys. And they not only had a sighting, they heard the thing, and it had come in, I guess, by that time, by the time I got there, almost a week had gone by. And so I sit down with the foreman of the crew who also had the sighting, and he's proceeding to tell me about what had happened on the night of the incident, that something had come down from the mountainside and it was roaring. And one of the guys, the way I remember it, one of the individuals told me it was so loud, this is almost a quote, that it was like a stadium loudspeaker about 3 feet in front of you. And so they knew that whatever was out there, this was not someone pulling a prank. They knew this was absolutely real. And they grabbed their guns and they left the area because they were absolutely scared. Then they came back later to complete the contract. And so as I'm interviewing this individual, I think his name was Clay Paulson, sitting on a makeshift picnic table out kind of out in the open where this river is. And so he said it, and it left tracks too. And so I have my tape recorder and I press pause or press stop, and I said, tracks. And I said, where, when? And he says, yeah, they're right over here. And so the soil was kind of sandy. So it didn't really leave good tracks, but there were indentations in the ground. And so that was the second time I had seen tracks. And so this was not just the tracks, but the sound and the sighting by the individuals, and their absolute credibility just came across almost instantly, because back then there was no social media. And so I don't know how word got out, but it did get out. And so that's how CNN picked it up, and that's how they contacted me. And so I'm looking at these about 13 and a half inch tracks in the ground, indentations by that time, about a week old. And again, it's hitting home that the magnitude of what had happened about a week before. There was a Bigfoot in this area. And it's just like, there was no way in my mind that I was thinking hoax. And I just wish those tracks would have been better had there been a different type of soil substance. But yeah, so there's the second time I'm getting another dose of Bigfoot in me, and it's just like I'm just getting more wound up by the whole thing. And so I became, well, even before that, a super fanatic of the subject matter. And even to this day, I mean, I'm publishing a newsletter called the Bigfoot Times, and it's gone on for 25 years. And so it's kind of like me bubbling over with my interest with a publication that people read.
I put on the cover of the YouTube video, I put on there that he was Bigfoot of the Year, and everyone said, "How do you get that title?" So I was back to you. So how do you choose people that you put on that list of Bigfooters of the Year?
Yeah, it's not easy because the selection process is entirely through the newsletter and through me. And it's just like I'm always looking for recommendations, but in the end, it's my decision. And Shane Carpenter last year, because of his work in an area called the 400, and just I had interviewed him several times. I was very impressed by what he was doing, and I said, I don't see anyone that's competing with this individual at the present time at the same level. And so he was our Bigfooter of the year.
You have done a lot of extensive work on analyzing the Patterson Gimlin films. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, let's go back to 1980. Again, this is Doug Trappin and myself. I was already in Washington State in another area with Peter Gatella on another trip in the summer of 1980. And so it's either we called or Rene DeHinden, the late Rene DeHinden from Richmond, British Columbia, calls us. And he wanted to know if we could make a trip up there. And it wasn't, we're close to the border already. So I said, well, why not? Let's go. This would be I had met Rene earlier that year in 1980, about March in Los Angeles when he was in Los Angeles. And so this is the summer, about August. And so we made the trip up there. And so I had already known about the Patterson Gimlin film. And by the way, for those people who want to know where the term Patterson Gimlin film came from, that was exclusively by the late Rene DeHinden. And so he always told me, he says, the reason why I call it the Patterson Gimlin film is to give Bob Gimlin a little bit of credit, because he was always the guy in the background. And so this way, if you call it the Patterson Gimlin film, it just recognizes the two individuals that were responsible for this film. And so getting back to the story, so we went up to Richmond, British Columbia at the Vancouver Gun Club and met with Rene. And so he sets up, you got to remember, this is not YouTube. This is not a video. This is not anything like that. He sets up his 16 millimeter projector, and he has what he called a master copy of the Patterson Gimlin film. And so we're looking at a screen. I forget whether he put a sheet up on the wall or what, But this was the first time I had seen projected from a master copy of the film on 16 millimeter, the Patterson Gimlin film. And it's like, no, it's like you could watch a video of on YouTube of like someone trying to train you how to ride a bicycle, but there's nothing like actually going out and doing it for yourself. So then this was kind of like almost like being there, because it just had a different look and feel to it watching the film on the screen. And you're seeing the film and then you're seeing the slow-mo of the film as well, and all the detail. And it just seemed like it was very vivid, very clear. And even at that time, I was 17. I go, well, geez, how can anyone say that this is just a really blurry film when I thought it was very clear in certain spots? And so I had seen a master copy, 16 millimeter, of the Patterson Gimlin film projected on a movie screen or on a screen. And I was very, very impressed. And there was Renee, one of the grand masters of Bigfooting, who had investigated the film for quite a bit, describing all the stuff about the film and what you see. And so we see the film, and then shortly thereafter, he has his top secret project. And got to remember, this is not the days of Facebook. Back then, Renee was very good at keeping a secret, because I had no idea what he was doing in Los Angeles in March of 1980. And so at the same time, there was another individual by the name of Bruce Bonney in Los Angeles, who had met Renee at the 1978 University of British Columbia conference called Man Like Monsters in Trial. And so he was a photographic expert, and he specialized, I guess, in 2.25 format cameras with film, not digital. And so they got together and they said, well, why don't we go down and get access to the original film, which at the time Renee was a 51% owner of the original film. And the film was in Los Angeles at the time. So the two of them went down. And so because of Bruce Bonney's photographic skills, they were able to take about 12 images from the film of the Patterson Gimlin film and make Cibachrome images. And my understanding of a Cibachrome image is basically it's a super saturation of the color, which in turn brings out a tremendous amount of detail in what you're seeing. And so they had cropped images, not so much of the background, but of the subject itself. And so Renee shares these images with us. And I kind of remember him saying, don't put your hand on the print, because they were small prints, maybe 4x6. He says, don't put your hand on the actual film, keep your fingers on the edge. So I have these in my hand. And this, at that time, none of this information was out to the public, period. It wasn't even in a book called Man Like Monsters on Trial, which was published, I guess, later that year. They were the first to publish the Cibachrome images from the film. And so we're looking at all of this, and this was their top secret mission when they were in Los Angeles, having access to the original film to do this work. And so this is how those Cibachrome images came about. And it's directly from the original film, which Renee had access to in 1980. And as far as I know, between him and Bruce Bonney, they were the last two people to have their physical hands on the original camera film from Roger Patterson's camera. Where the film is today, I don't know. But I was impressed by the amount of work that Renee had done at the film, especially at the film side, trying to determine distances from the camera to the subject, from the camera to the big tree, etc. And I just said, I didn't think that I would be the next person in line to be so obsessed by the film, because I didn't think that was me. And so when he passed on, I started becoming, or even before that, a lot more interested in all the intricacies and the details about the Patterson Gimlin film, like who was the guy that wrote the first newspaper article about it? Where was the film processed? Where is the camera that Roger used, which was a rental from the Yakima Shepherd's camera in Yakima, Washington? So all of these things Renee was working on, and I was kind of like listening to him and also saying like, whoa, okay, if he's launching these investigations, so I should probably do the same. And so that's how I became kind of a nut obsessive about the film as well. And so let's just cut to the chase. In my opinion, the film is 50 some years old. Is that what you see on that film strip is a real living female Bigfoot. And there's no possibility in my mind that it could be a man in a suit. And it has never been demonstrated to be anything but what the photographer claimed. And if it is a fabricated film, that no one has been able to duplicate it. And so, in science in general, if, say, for instance, you look back in the history of science, there was a time when Fleischmann and Pons said that they were able to develop cold fusion. And so a bunch of other scientists said, well, what's the recipe? We want to do it and confirm what you've done. And nobody could do it. And so they realized that cold fusion was a fraud. And so the same thing can be applied to the Patterson Gimlin film, that if it is, in fact, just a person in a costume, say, for instance, Bob Hieronymus from Yakima, Washington, then surely another person should be able to jump into a costume and almost duplicate that film. But to date, no one has. So that in itself is very telling.
Does anything else out there stand the test to say, yeah, this is legit?
You're talking about other films?
Yes.
Well, I would say the Stacy Brown footage that he got with a thermal in Florida with his late father. And I spoke with, before he passed away, Stacy Brown Sr. and Stacy Brown Jr. I was able to speak with both of them. I guess at the time they really didn't know me too much from Adam, but I was very impressed, and I'm very impressed by that footage. And even though it's a short piece of footage and it's a thermal, the thermal footage they got in April, I guess, of 2001 in Australia, although that's not North America, I'm very impressed by it and the circumstances that surround it. And in fact, I wrote about it a little bit in the latest edition of the newsletter for July. In Washington State in August of 1992, the late Paul Freeman got what he calls the Freeman footage from Deduck Spring. And I'm still sitting on the fence on that footage, and a lot of people think it's the second best thing to the PG film, but there's so many questions about it. And Paul Freeman gave a lecture for the Western Bigfoot Society meet, and I guess that was about 1997. And he's talking about the footage. At the time, people didn't know a whole lot about the Freeman footage. And he's talking about the footage. So if it's shot in 92 and he's there in 97 talking at a meet, you wouldn't even know that he's talking about the same thing. And I wrote about that in the newsletter as well, that there's all these, maybe not so much discrepancies, but I'm saying, like, are we talking about the same video that he's talking about? And so he's got it scripted a little bit different than later versions of the story. And so the film by itself, or the video by itself, seems to be compelling, but his story, unless he's not very good with information or facts, is problematic in my view. But I've been up. Last summer, I had the opportunity to go to that film site, which is still surprisingly very much intact. And it's an excellent spot for Bigfoot. So I don't know. All I can say is, personally, as a Bigfoot investigator, I'm sitting on the fence with not just Paul Freeman's video, but with a lot of his data, the footprints that were collected and stuff. I'm sure there's Bigfoot up in the Blue Mountains there. but the amount of data that Paul collected, it is just overwhelming that you would say, like, how can, or you would ask the question, how can one individual be so lucky? And why, since Paul Freeman passed away, I guess in 2001 or thereabouts, that no one has been as lucky as him? So that's the question.
You started the Bigfoot Times, your paper, your publication. And how did you come about with that? What year did you start that, and how did you decide to do that as a publication?
Well, there's two stories about the Bigfoot Times. There was one, a short lived Bigfoot Times, one word, Bigfoot Times with no two T's. And that was the first one when I was in high school. And I was actually had a small subscription for that. For There was about 25, 30 people that subscribed. And it ran from, I believe, 1979 to 1986. And so that was kind of a small effort. And then I got busy with my career, busy with life, and busy with work and all those other things. And so I didn't return to publishing till January of 1998. And so I guess late 1997, I was probably shopping at an electronics store, and I was looking at these new things that they called laptop computers that were portable. And I was just wowed by it. And I said, wow, I said, I should probably get one of these and start publishing another newsletter because it's making it easier for someone to do something like that. So in January of 1998, I launched another newsletter called Bigfoot Times, two words, and a shameless promotion. I'll put this in front of my face, but there is the spelling of it right there. And so this has been going on for a little over 25 years, and we've built up a substantial membership all over the world. The majority of our members are in Ohio, and it's a physical paper publication that is actually mailed to the membership through the United States Postal Service. And so this is actually the July edition, which will be mailed out this weekend.
So I'm assuming, based upon a lot of the things that you've said, that you think these creatures are just a flesh and blood creature in the wild. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I have no reason to believe anything but that. And I've yet to meet anyone on the planet, past, present, or even the future, who can demonstrate that we have woo creatures of any sort or shape floating around on the planet. I mean, if the wolverine were not an established fact in North America, there would probably be, say, for instance, if we didn't establish it as fact and it was still running around and we didn't know whether it was a factual animal, there would probably be, at this point in time, a lot of woo ideas about the wolverine, which we know is just a flesh and blood animal. And so I suspect, because Bigfoot is such a rare species, the numbers aren't that big population wise, and that people don't see them all the time, such as you and I could walk out our front door and see a dog or a cat within a couple of hours. But that's not the case with Bigfoot. And it gets down to how dense is the population. I mean, the leaner it gets, the more difficult it would be to have a sighting, especially if they're living in the woods where most people do not live. And so you could take it a step further, say the lotto or something, and there's only one winning prize. There's only one winning person. And so there's hundreds of millions of people that live in the United States, and all the other people are not going to have that opportunity, say, for instance, to see that one lotto ticket. And say, if you were to reason that perhaps there were maybe 50 Bigfoot in the state of Washington, it's not like every citizen in the state of Washington is going to see one, because they're out in the woods doing their thing. And it's just like, it's a rare sighting. It's a rare sighting if you see a wolverine.
What do you think is going to be the best possibility to get some hard, concrete evidence here?
Well, the more the more I think about it, the more I look at the matter, it seems like it's probably going to be by sheer accident that something might happen in terms of hard physical evidence. And by that, I don't mean eDNA. I'm talking about a substantial portion of the body or a body itself. That time hasn't come yet. And so we're all kind of just waiting. If you look back to 1967 and Roger Patterson went down to Northern California not to get a film of a Bigfoot. He went there because there were other tracks, Bigfoot tracks reported up on Blue Creek Mountain that Renee DeHinden and John Green went down to investigate. And so he was able to break away, not in August, September, but he wasn't able to get away till October. And so he and Bob came down hoping to see perhaps the remnants of those tracks or other tracks. And as Bob Gimlin said, he says, we were just looking at a bunch of muddy puddles because it had rained and there was really nothing to see, but they were in that area. So they made a decision to stay. And by Roger Patterson's own admission, he wanted to get footage of some more tracks for a documentary that he was working on. And so instead of getting footprints, he was able to get the track maker itself. And so that was just one of those things where you got exceedingly lucky. And you just happened, as they say, he was in exactly the right place at the right time to make this happen. And so it's an astonishing piece of footage. And it's about a minute long. And there's a good section of the film there in the centerpiece where the subject looks back. Most people think that it's the look back sequence is looking at Roger Patterson. In fact, that's incorrect. The look back sequence, he's looking at Bob Gimlin because just shortly before, Bob Gimlin had rode across this creek with his horse. And so the subject that was being filmed wanted to know where he was because the subject already knew where Roger was standing because Roger was trying to approach the subject. And it's demonstrable where you can see this as Roger crosses the creek and the film jumps up and down and then he gets some steady pictures. So as all of this is happening, his partner, Bob Gimlin, goes across the creek. And so the subject wanted to know, where is this other individual in relationship to me? And by then, there's a little more than 100 feet of distance between them, which is a good distance if you lay out a tape measure. And so that could be a comfortable distance for a deer or any wild animal to just kind of, if it's walking away from you, to just not really be too excited.
So you've written first a booklet, now an expanded version, Bigfoot of Bluff Creek. Tell me about that.
In 1992 was the 25th anniversary of the Patterson Gimlin film. So I remember I was in good contact with long distance phone calls with John Green and Renee DeHinden. And I wish I would have saved some of those long distance phone bills so I could put them up on the screen here. But yeah, so I was in touch with them and I told them what I wanted to do. And I asked them if they would participate, and they both did, as did Bob Titmus and Dr. Grover Krantz and Bob Gimlin and Lyle Laverty, who had seen the tracks on the sandbar. I did taped interviews with them so I could publish Bigfoot at Bluff Creek. And because of having to do the 9 to 5 thing, I wasn't able to get it out till 1994 when Bigfoot at Bluff Creek came out, a small booklet. And then I republished in 2003. And the republication I added an extensive bibliography to Bigfoot at Bluff Creek. And so since that time, I pretty much got a new manuscript ready on Bigfoot at Bluff Creek, which is more of a pictorial. And so I guess I could say a little bit about it. It's still, I would say maybe 75% done now. But this is going to be a booklet you could kind of think of On the Track of the Sasquatch, which John Green wrote in 1968, which was, I want to say, maybe just short of 90 pages. It's going to be of that format, of that size. And it's, when I say pictorial, uh, most people don't realize that in June of 1968, a fellow by the name of George Haas, who was with John Green and Jim McLaren, when Jim McLaren did the recreation walk on the Patterson Gimlin film site, George Haas from the Bay Area, which is the San Francisco area, was with them. And he took slides of the film site as they were in progress doing their thing. And you wouldn't think of it back then like it was like, whatever, just a weekend. And so he shot the film site up from like, not just from Roger Patterson's point of view, but from different angles. And so these slides they've never been printed in any book. And so when George passed away, his collection went to a fellow by the name of Warren Thompson. And when Warren Thompson passed away, his collection ended up with me, along with those slides. And so those slides are going to be printed, at least some of them, in this new book, in which you're going to be able to see the Patterson Gimlin film site like you've never seen before. And so that is why it's going to be a pictorial book, because they're breathtaking in terms of, wow, you've never seen the film site quite like this. And also, in one of the prints, there is toilet paper that with rocks on top of them. This is June of 68, where the Patterson Gimlin subject, we'll call her Patty, had walked, and the indentations of her trackway were still visible. And this is how they were able to take Jim McLaren and align him to walk parallel to the trackway that was already left. So a lot of people who may be listening to this podcast or whatever, where you say like, no, that can't be. The trackway can't be there. That from October of 67 to June of 68, that just can't be. But the Bluff Creek Project with Robert Leiterman and Stephen Strufert, they went and experimented on that film site by leaving tracks on it, and to see how long just a regular trackway would last. And it lasted, to my memory, almost a year. So that soil up in that country preserves tracks remarkably well. So the argument can be made that the trackway from October 20th of 67 was still intact as indentations on June 23rd of 1968, when John Green, Jim McLaren, and George Haas were present doing their work.
And you have quite a collection of references on your website, books on Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Tell me about what motivated you to put that together.
Well, the motivation behind that, as the years went on, let's just take it from maybe 2010 to 2015, and you jump on Amazon or you jump on Facebook or whatever, it just seemed to be that every time you turned around, there seemed to be a new book being published on the Bigfoot subject, whether it was from a major publisher or self-published. And it seems like most of the books these days are self-published. But I said, well, it seemed to me that the majority of people in Bigfooting could not afford to get all the books. And I said, well, wouldn't it be neat? And I had thought about this, I think around 2014, to have a massive listing of every book on Bigfoot or very related, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or erotic or whatever the case may be, because I'm not there to be your decision maker, but just a listing of all the books, and whether it's published by a major publisher or self-published. And to date, all of that could be seen on the Bigfoot Times website. It's the Project Bigfoot Books, and we have listed over 1,300 books to date. And many of these people can scroll through and see the entire list, and you could access the list by the author's last name, or you could access this by punching in the title or putting in a date. say you put in a date of 1980, it'll show you how many books that were published in 1980. If you go to, say, 2020, it'll show you all the books that were published in 2020. And in 2020, there was a heck of a lot more books being published than in 1980 on the Bigfoot subject. But I thought that would be a really good utility for the Bigfoot community. And I wanted to be behind it because I had thought about it for so long. And I said, wouldn't this be neat to do? And so I've done it, and it's an ongoing project.
Talked a lot about the footprints, and those are very popular to to show us some evidence. Some people think there are structures out there. What are your opinion on the structures?
Well, I was just reading Tony Healy and Paul Cropper's latest book on the Yowie, which is the Australian equivalent of Bigfoot. And in the one instance where they talk about the April 2021 thermal video, they are talking about these sticks being jammed into the ground, not really big sticks, but literally jammed into the ground. And the people there were trying to duplicate it, and they weren't having much success. And they seem to think that this is probably markers that these things are putting out there. But here in North America, in various spots, people are finding these massive tree structures. And I know three people that have some skepticism towards that idea is Dr. Jeff Meldrum, Cliff Barackman, and myself, in the sense that, okay, you have these tree structures and, in various spots, and could it have been made by just people? And it's just like, to me, what would be the smoking gun about those ideas is like if you had some really clear evidence of a trackway in that immediate vicinity, because whoever is doing that is not only got their weight behind them, but the weight of moving these trees and toppling these trees or branches and doing these structures. And so I'm open to the idea, but it's just like I'm not 100% sold on it. And so that's my feeling on it, but I wouldn't say, discard it entirely. I think if you're doing investigations, in particular in the Midwest and the East, and where you have these stick structures or branch structures showing up, that maybe you should pay attention to it if that's what you think Bigfoot is doing. I don't understand what the motivation would be for a Bigfoot to be doing this, because it doesn't seem like doing something like that would have of any particular significance to them. I might be wrong, but it's just like, it seems to me like they would be more interested in finding something to eat, because there's no supermarket out there in the woods.
Of all of the years of research, and goodness, you have many years of time to both read, interview people. You've associated yourself many times or know a lot of people who have really devoted a lot of time and effort to this subject. So tell me about some of the people that you that you know, and some of the research that you have been part of, and just elaborate on that.
Well, I'm going to throw some names at you, and your viewership probably might know some of them. I've met a lot of people in Bigfooting, including Ivan Marks, Paul Freeman, Bob Titmus, Renee DeHinden, John Green, Dr. Grover Krantz, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, Dr. Vladimir Markotic, Thomas Steenberg, Sam Sherry, who was active in Pennsylvania, and Stan Gordon, who's in Pennsylvania. And I've met all these people throughout my career as a Bigfooter, either going to spots where they were or them coming to me. And I think for me, though, the two people that had the most impact on what I'm doing is John Green and Renee DeHinden, because they were always serious about the subject matter. And we often had discussions about, well, what if they're being dropped off by UFOs and flying saucers or whatever? And I think Renee in particular chuckled once, and he said, well, if that's the case, he says, I'll jump on the flying saucer and take off with them. And but they never felt in both of their careers as Bigfooters. I don't think they could ever make that connection between UFOs and Bigfoot, and they thought they were just two entirely separate subjects. If that makes sense to you. It was not the internet. It was a little more personal because we were exchanging postal letters rather than emails. And so you'd wait and get a letter in the mail, and they would tell you what their thoughts were. And so that's how things worked early on. And I'm just privileged and happy to have been a part of that era as a teenager writing to these people. I don't think I ever gave away my age at the time, but maybe they soon realized I was much younger than them. And so they're both gone now, but they had a very big impact on me. And John, when I was up at John's place, John Green's place, the first time I was up there was May of 1994. He gave me complete access to his files, and he had a photocopy machine there. So this was not at the time where you could just scan something and send it via email or whatever. It was still somewhat primitive, but I went through his files, and I saw a lot of information that was of interest to me. And he said, "Oh, why don't you just make photocopies of it?" Which I did. And so I brought it home and either integrated it into an edition of the Bigfoot Times newsletter or put it in my files or something of that nature.
So what has changed, since the early days of the research and these people being very devoted to finding as much information as possible? What more is known today?
What has changed is I think it's become more of a social activity rather than an investigation and a research. There's nothing wrong with being social, and it's just like we have today. What has changed is we have, I mean, all you have to do is jump on Facebook, and probably every month of every year today, someone's having a Bigfoot meet. And it's not necessarily about the research and investigation. It's more of a social activity. And it's just like, I mean, you look on Facebook and another meet has just concluded, and you see people, pictures of people, smiling for the screen or for their Facebook photo, but you don't really see a lot of discussion about the evidence or the research that they've been doing. And so maybe it's become a more of a social activity, but by the same time, because of the internet, because of social media, because of Facebook in particular, the field has grown exponentially. There's a lot more people interested, and there's a lot more. In my view, there's a greater public awareness that there's something going on there, Bigfoot wise. And I'm not just talking about the social activities, I'm talking about the evidence itself. And for instance, you could look back several years ago up in the Olympic Peninsula where these nests were found that were allegedly made by Bigfoot. And they tried to do some eDNA testing on some of the nest or whatever, but it came back inconclusive. But then you scratch your head and you said, okay, it's inconclusive. They didn't really find hairs there that are positively identified as Bigfoot. But like I said, you scratch your head on all these nesting areas or quote unquote nesting areas, and you said, like, well, who exactly is making these nests? Is this the responsibility of a bear, which is atypical for them to be doing anything of this nature? And that is the question: is who is making this nest up in the Olympic Peninsula that we're not quite certain of? And I guess the suspected culprit would likely be Bigfoot. And again, you might even say like these massive tree structures might be Bigfoot too. And it's just like the only thing about that, I would think that in some of those areas that you'd expect to see a lot of footprints. And and maybe with the Olympic Peninsula nests too, that you would hope to be able to tie a footprint to those nests. And I'm not certain if they have, because that's not necessarily something I know a whole lot about.
There's certainly a lot more information, like you said, a lot of books written. It's a kind of a trendy subject right now. that people just kind of jumping on board and kind of want to be part of it because it's a mystery. I think that keeps people intrigued also.
I I think there's just a lot more. There's a lot more podcasts. There's a lot more History Channel, and television in general is doing a lot more with it. And it's a very interesting topic because it's a big mystery. It's a big question. It it's a question that hasn't been solved, and there's still two camps that are saying, well, what you're seeing is just all folklore and mythology because there is no physical evidence that has been attributed to Bigfoot. And then there's the people who are on the other side of the coin who said, like, no, what it indicates is that there is a species of unknown primate here in North America that is responsible for the footprints and the sightings that people are having. And that's the camp that I'm in, because you look at some of the footprints that have been found here in the Pacific Northwest, in particular in the Bluff Creek area, including but not limited to the Patterson Gimlin film. Some of these tracks have been impressed into the ground very deep. And when in the book I'm writing, there was a couple of parties, Jim McLaren, Richard Henry, and Lyle Laverty, who all stated that they walked adjacent to the trackway on the Patterson Gimlin film site, and they could not come anywhere near the depth of the tracks that they were viewing. And so that should tell you something about the weight behind these things. And so if these tracks or any of the other tracks were faked, especially the deep tracks, no one has demonstrated how to fake those. And the same thing with the London trackway from 2011. One of the first individuals there, when I interviewed, I forget the guy's name, but I wanted to say he was close to 300 pounds, and his imprints were not coming close to the trackway that the London track maker from London, Oregon was leaving. And so that kind of makes you scratch your head, like, if someone is faking these tracks, what are they doing to make them so deep? Unless, of course, it's actually a Bigfoot that's very heavy that is impressing these tracks into the ground 3/4 of an inch deep, which might be very hard for a person to do.
And also the stride, is usually oftentimes so massive that a human being can't even begin to step that far.
Well, there again, you look at two instances from 67, the Patterson Gimlin trackway, and the London trackway from Oregon. In the average step was over 40 inches. And if you were to take the average man trying to make those steps, that's a very big step. And when I gave a lecture, I guess a year ago or a year and a half ago in Michigan, we had the tallest person in the audience, which was, I want to say he was over 6 feet tall. And I said, I put some tape marks on the floor, and I said, this is 42 inches from step to step. And I said, I would like anyone to try to duplicate this, just not the depth, just the steps, the step length. And so he's doing it in front of an entire audience, my test subject, and he's not able to do it without really extending his other foot to the tape mark I've set on the floor. And so, again, that's a head scratcher that whoever is leaving these tracks has got a big step. And so, again, it's a head scratcher in the sense that, okay, how exactly are they doing this if they're faking them? You'd have to be running, but if you're running, anyone who's seasoned in track detecting or looking at tracks would say, like, okay, this is whoever did this was running, and it's very obvious. You could see the indentation in the ground. If you were to go watch, say, for instance, a mud run or something, the local mud run, 5K, 10K, whatever it may be, and say there's instances where there's mud, you could see that, oh, it's pretty obvious these people are not walking, they're running, and you could see it in the mud. And so in the case with London, it was not obvious that something was running, but seemed to be plainly obvious that something was walking on that area. And so that's the question. It's just like, if it's running, you could probably detect it very easily, but if it's walking, uh, the majority of the population doesn't walk with steps that are 42 inches from step to step.
Is there anything else you think that would add to this interview?
I would say there's a lot of people who do get out in the woods a lot more than me at the present time. And I would say if you're finding anything, document it as best you can, especially in terms of photos, the location, everything you can. That's really very important. It's just like the documentation of any evidence that you might find in the woods is, don't just say, come back and say like, oh, I saw this or this, but document it by way of a little notebook or your cell phone camera as best you can. And hopefully if you have some sort of tape measure with you or something where you can get a scale.
And what about people who are reluctant to come forward because there's so much disbelief and ridicule? Any advice for them?
Well, I don't know what to say, because there's, even in 2023, there's still a lot of people that are good members of the community that have seen something that don't want to be part of this stigma that we call Bigfoot. And, I'd love for them to come forward to add to the database of what's existing in terms of sighting and footprints, but they want no part of it because of the ridicule factor. And so I can understand that. And so that's their own personal decision. And there's not much I can say on that. If you haven't seen the Bigfoot Times website, you should visit and see what it's all about. And I would say if someone has published a newsletter for 25 years, a quarter of a century, and has been successful doing it, there's probably a reason why.